I had been telling myself all week that the hostel would feel less suffocating once the semester wound down. But on that particular evening, the air inside my small room seemed heavier than usual. The rain outside was relentless, drumming against the thin glass window in a rhythm that made the quiet inside even more pronounced. Evan's last text still glowed on my phone screen, short, polite, and colder than it should have been. We'd been together for nearly 2 years, but lately, our conversations have become more like formal updates than the late-night confessions they used to be. Adrian, my roommate, was supposed to be out. I'd overheard him earlier, laughing with some guys about catching a movie and then hitting a late-night diner. That meant I had the room to myself, rare and, in my mind, much needed. I was sprawled on my bed, half reading an assignment, half scrolling through playlists, when a metallic click of the door's lock jolted me upright. The door swung open, and Adrian stepped in. Damp strands of his brown hair clung to his forehead. His T-shirt darkened in patches where the rain had caught him. He shut the door with a quick motion, tossing his backpack to the floor in a way that suggested frustration. "Change of plans," he said, kicking off his shoes without looking at me. "Movie got canceled. Power outage in half the block." I offered a casual nod, though my chest had tightened with an odd awareness. Adrian had that unshaken confidence people seem to be born with, shoulders loose, voice unhurried, eyes that didn't dart around nervously like mine often did. Everyone in the hostel seemed to like him. He was the kind of guy who could talk to a stranger in the cafeteria line and have them laughing within minutes. "You didn't have to walk back in the rain," I said, trying to focus on my book again. He shrugged, peeling off his damp jacket. "Didn't have a choice. Bus stop was packed, and it's just water." He hung the jacket on the chair by his desk, then turned and crossed the room, not to his own bed, but to mine. Adrian sat down on the edge, leaning back on his palms, as if he owned the space. He'd done it before, and I'd never told him not to, though I always felt a strange shift in the air when he did. "You busy?" he asked, glancing at the open textbook beside me. "Kind of," I said, though my eyes kept drifting to the way the fabric of his shirt stretched faintly across his chest. "Just trying to get through this reading." He smiled faintly, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Looks boring." "It is." I closed it, telling myself I was doing it for the sake of conversation, not because I wanted him to stay. He reached over, taking my phone from the pillow beside me. "You've been listening to the same playlist since last month." I reached to grab it back, but his hand shifted, and for a moment our fingers brushed. It was nothing, just skin against skin for the briefest instant, but it landed with the weight of something unspoken. My pulse kicked up, and I sat back before I could overthink it. Adrian didn't seem to notice, or maybe he did, but chose not to say anything. Instead, he scrolled through the music, shaking his head at some of my choices. "Man, you've got no taste in half of these," he teased. I rolled my eyes. "And you're some kind of expert?" "Better than you," he said, grinning now. The rain outside had eased to a faint patter, the kind that barely registered until you listened for it. Inside, though, the silence between us began to take shape, not awkward, exactly, but charged. I could feel in the way Adrian stayed seated instead of getting up, and how his voice had softened without losing that teasing edge. "You ever think about moving out after this year?" he asked suddenly. I shrugged. "Maybe. Haven't decided." He nodded, his gaze holding mine for a second longer than necessary. It was the smallest thing, but it made my stomach knot. I told myself not to read into it. Adrian was straight. He had a girlfriend off campus. This was just normal. Still, when he reached over to set my phone down, his hand rested on the mattress between us for a moment longer than needed. Just enough to make me wonder if I was imagining everything. The thought lodged itself in my mind, stubborn and unwelcome, even as I leaned back and tried to focus on something else. But as he settled into conversation, telling me a story about some prank from the previous night, my attention was only half on his words. The other half was counting every detail. The curve of his smile, the faint scent of rain still clinging to him, and the way my own restraint felt thinner with every passing minute. By the time the lights flickered from a distant thunderclap, I already knew the night wasn't going to unfold the way I'd expected. Adrian stayed seated on my bed long after his story ended, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, hands clasped. There was a looseness to him tonight, like the usual social armor he wore in front of everyone else had slipped. I wasn't sure if it was the storm, the canceled plans, or just the fact that it was the two of us in this quiet little room. But something about his presence felt heavier, more deliberate. He glanced at the door, then back at me. "You and Evan still good?" The question came out casually, but his eyes didn't match the tone. I hesitated, unsure whether to answer honestly. "Yeah, we're fine," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Adrian tilted his head slightly, like he was weighing whether push. "Just asking. You don't talk about him much anymore." I shifted against the pillow, the truth pressing against my teeth. Things have been different. Distance is harder than I thought. He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to his hands. "Yeah, distance changes people. Sometimes for the better, sometimes not." The words lingered between us. I wanted to ask what he meant, but before I could, he reached over and pulled the blanket from under me, draping it across his lap like he'd done it 100 times before. "You're freezing," he said. "I'm fine," I replied, but I didn't move the blanket back to my side. The fabric stretched between us, an unspoken bridge neither of us acknowledged. He leaned back, propping himself against the wall. "Girlfriend's been giving me hell lately," he said after a pause. I tried to sound neutral. "Why?" "She thinks I'm not paying her enough attention. Always wants more calls, more time, more of me. And He trailed off, rubbing the back of his neck. "Sometimes I just want to be here, with people who don't expect me to be something I'm not all the time." The remark landed harder than I expected. I didn't know if I was one of those people he meant, but I wanted to be. Adrian's phone buzzed on his desk. He ignored it. Instead, he turned toward me, his knee brushing against mine. It was light, barely contact, but it sent an involuntary current up my spine. "You've always been easy to talk to," he said, his voice lower now. I forced a small laugh. "That's because I don't tell you what to do." "Exactly," he murmured, holding my gaze. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to fade. My awareness narrowed to the space between us. How little there was of it now. How close his hand was to mine on the blanket. My pulse thudded in my ears. He noticed. I could tell. His eyes flicked down for the briefest second before returning to mine, as if confirming some suspicion. "You ever feel like you're not supposed to want something, but you do anyway?" he asked. My throat tightened. "Yeah," I said quietly. "All the time." Neither of us moved. The silence grew dense, threaded with something unnameable but undeniable. I could feel my resolve thinning. Every warning I'd given myself about boundaries, about loyalty to Evan, about not misreading Adrian, slipping further away. Then, without a word, he reached for my phone again. This time, when our fingers touched, neither of us pulled back. The contact was small, almost nothing, but it rooted me to the spot. He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. Guess we're both bad at keeping things simple. I swallowed hard. Guess so. The next seconds felt suspended, my breath shallow, his posture leaning just slightly toward me, the blanket still stretched between us like a fragile tether. Outside, another low rumble of thunder rolled through, the flicker of lightning briefly lighting the contours of his face. For one dizzying instant, I thought he might close the space completely. My body was braced for it, part of me wanting it, part of me terrified of what it would mean. Instead, he just sat there, watching me like he was waiting for a signal I couldn't bring myself to give. When the lights in the hallway dimmed for a moment, plunging the room into a softer glow, his voice cut through the quiet. "No one would ever have to know," he said. I froze, my pulse loud in my ears. There was no mistaking the implication. By the time the power steadied and the light returned, I knew. Whatever happened next, this night would mark a line I couldn't uncross. The air in the room felt different after Adrian said it. No one would ever have to know. It wasn't a casual remark. It was a key, quietly slid across the table, daring me to pick it up. I searched his face, looking for hesitation, a smirk that would tell me it was a joke. But there was none. He held my gaze, steady, unflinching, like he was challenging me to be honest about what we both already understood. My mind flashed Evan, his smile, the sound of his laugh during our first late-night call, the quiet promises we'd made each other. But those memories felt distant now. Faint outlines compared to the sharp, immediate reality of Adrian sitting just inches away. "I'm not sure it's a good idea," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. Adrian leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "Probably isn't," he admitted. "But sometimes the wrong thing feels," he stopped, letting the sentence hang unfinished, as if the ending was obvious. The blanket still connected us, a soft thread of fabric running from his lap to mine. He lifted it with one hand, folding it back toward me, but his fingers brushed my knee on the way. It wasn't an accident. "You think too much," he said with a faint smile. "I have to," I replied, though the conviction in my voice was faltering. He shifted closer, not enough to be overt, but enough that I could feel the heat radiating from him. My pulse stuttered. Every instinct told me to stand, to put space between us. But I didn't. I stayed, caught between the guilt pressing in from one side and the pull of him from the other. The silence between us became something tangible, weighty, charged. I was suddenly aware of how small the room felt, how the muted hum of the rain outside seemed to fall in time with my heartbeat. Adrian's eyes flicked to my lips for the briefest second before returning to mine. It was a tiny betrayal of whatever restraint he was holding on to. I felt it like a spark under the skin. When he finally moved, it was slow, deliberate. His hand found mine, palm warm, fingers curling loosely at first, as if giving me the chance to pull away. I didn't. The contact was simple, almost innocent, but my chest tightened all the same. He studied me, looking for something, permission maybe, or proof that he wasn't alone in this. "You can tell me to stop," he said, voice barely above a whisper. I didn't. The space between us dissolved. His forehead rested against mine for a moment, and in that pause, I knew we'd already crossed the first invisible line. The kiss, when it came, was unhurried yet certain, as if it had been waiting in the wings for far too long. It wasn't fireworks. It wasn't the cinematic rush I might have imagined. It was quieter, heavier, filled with all the things we weren't supposed to admit. When I pulled back, breath uneven, reality came rushing back. Evan's name thudded against my thoughts like a warning bell. My hands curled into fists in the blanket, grounding me in the guilt that was already taking root. Adrian exhaled, leaning back slightly, his eyes still on me. "Guess we're both bad at staying in our lanes," he said, half smiling, though there was a flicker of something like uncertainty in his expression. I couldn't answer. I didn't trust my voice to sound like it should. For a long moment, we sat in that fragile quiet, the storm outside winding down to a faint drizzle. The spell was breaking, but the air between us still held the echo of what had just happened. When Adrian finally stood, stretching his arms, it felt abrupt. He didn't look at me as he crossed to his desk, picking up his phone. "You should get some sleep," he said over his shoulder. I nodded, though I knew sleep wouldn't come easily, as he climbed into his own bed. Turning away, I stared at the ceiling, the dim light throwing shadows across the plaster. I told myself this was a one-time mistake, something that would dissolve by morning. But when he shifted under his blanket and said, just loud enough for me to hear, "Wasn't the last time," I knew I was lying to myself.